Hello, my name is Heath Jones, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. Our podcast is a production of Northwood Christian Church. That's the church that I pastor. And if you'd like to learn more about us, please visit our website at www.indYncc.org. That's www.ndncc.org. And there you can learn more about us, about our ministries, our service times, and the different ways that you might become involved. If you are listening to this as a podcast, I'd like to encourage you to like, subscribe, or follow the Northwood Podcast by way of whatever app that you use to listen. That will help you because then you'll be notified when we release new episodes. But also, I've heard that it helps our podcast out a lot if you rate us or leave a review. That writing reviews and rating us will help the Northwood Podcast find its way to more people on the internet by way of the algorithms. I'm not sure how it works, but please feel free to engage us in these ways, and we'd be truly grateful. Our podcast, the Northwood Podcast, is produced by it is produced and distributed by the All Indiana Podcast Network. And you can learn more about the All Indiana Podcast Network by visiting their website at allindianapodcastnetwork.com, or you can find the podcast that they produce by visiting www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's www.wishtv.com/podcasts. And there you can find dozens and dozens of other podcasts covering a variety of topics and interests. And all of them are produced right here in Indiana. So please check them out. For today, we'll be kicking off the season of Advent, if you can believe it. We are almost upon Christmas. So we're kicking off this season of Advent by considering a Bible passage that's from the Gospel of Matthew, specifically chapter 24, verses 36 through 44. But first, we need to pause for an ad break for our podcast audience, so we'll be back in a moment. And we're back. Or maybe you never left. Either way, the Bible passage that we're going to be going over is found, as I said moments before, in the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, and we will be considering verses 36 through 44. But about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together. One will be taken and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. That last parable that Jesus told in today's text really grabs me because it brings me back to my childhood. He says that the arrival of God's realm is like the arrival of a thief. And this is not the only time that Jesus uses this metaphor, and it is to place an emphasis on the suddenness of God's breaking into our lives. That's just as a thief might interrupt your life in an unexpected way. It's the suddenness that he is trying to emphasize here. He says here that if you knew when the break-in would occur, then you'd stay awake for it. You wouldn't be caught off guard. You'd be ready at just the right time to receive the intruder. The reason that this parable is relatable is because it makes me think about, at least relatable to me, is because it makes me think about the times that my mom would shut me in my room when I was a kid and command me to clean it. She'd say, "I'll be back later to check on you." And I didn't know when she'd be back. She just said later. So I knew that I'd better stay on the ball, because if she opened that door to find that I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do, then I'd be caught unawares and unprepared to make a defense of my inactivity. And if I knew the precise moment she'd arrive, I'd put off the work. Probably I would have put off the work and do the bare minimum, knowing that I could make up for my laziness with a frantic flurry of activity just 5 minutes before she came in, if I knew when she was coming. But since I did not know the hour of her coming, I knew that I'd better be prepared whatever the case, and had definitely better stay awake. Taking a nap never occurred to me. Such it is with the coming of God. The question is, when the Lord comes, does the Lord bring good things, or does the Lord bring terror? That's another thing that increases anxiety about passages like this, because if you listen to some people talk, you would think that it was terror that was coming into our laps. And every year, Advent kicks off with an apocalyptic text, something like what we just read, and it can come off as rather confusing to our modern readers in these modern times, because when we are usually considering these texts, or when they come at us, maybe somebody bombards us with a text like this, they're done so by an end-timesy preacher or somebody at least interested in those things, telling us that the end is nigh. So you might wonder why the folks who put together the lectionary, put together the selection of biblical texts that most churches, many churches at least, read on Sundays, why would they pick off an apocalyptic text to kick off Advent this year? And every year, in fact, most every year kicks off in this way. Why, if what is coming, what the apocalypse brings, is something terrible and cataclysmic? And here, I just have to name a large part of the problem, is that when apocalyptic literature is read today, it is read by a fairly confused audience. That's what I'm describing, this confusion. And this is why this word, apocalypse, has taken on an ominous feel. This is a word that carries a lot of baggage for many people. And I'm sure you're familiar with the way that this word functions in our discourse. So when I ask you, what does apocalypse mean to you, you might say that it means the end of the world. If I asked you another question, when somebody asks you if you are ready for the coming apocalypse, what do you think they mean? Most certainly you would think they meant, are you ready for the end of the world? And a cataclysmic end it is supposed to be too, if we are to believe them. We are told that a time is coming when the whole world will be brought down on our heads. And this is what the apocalypse means to many, if not most people. So if I said that there was an apocalyptic-minded person somewhere, you might think I was describing someone who seemed fixated on the end of things. The problem is that modern readers do not understand this genre of apocalypse and how it is to be read and how it was understood in antiquity, specifically during the centuries near and around the time of Jesus. That's where the confusion comes, because these words were first spoken, the ones that we read from the Gospel of Matthew, they were first spoken and then written down to a Jewish audience, for a Jewish audience that understood this genre of apocalyptic literature. And it is a genre of literature in its own right, a genre of literature. So, for example, today we have the genres of science fiction in literature, murder mystery, action and romance, history, biography, autobiography, romantic poetry. We can really get in the weeds. And the reading public understands how each of these genres speak to us, how they communicate. I mean, you wouldn't read a history book in the same way that you'd read a romantic poem. That would be ridiculous. And how much more silly to read a romantic poem as history, ignoring the use of metaphor and symbolism. So if a poet said, "My love is like an ocean," or "my love is an ocean," you'd be pretty confused if you took that literally. You know, you've got the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, and the Love Ocean as described in the poem. Nonsense, because it's not geography. You know, it's a poem. It's not to be taken that literally, but here's the thing. This word apocalypse that we're talking about doesn't mean the end. Never has. It's a word that means literally an unveiling of what is hidden. And what was hidden for the Jewish and Christian apocalyptic writers was the way in which God was going to bring about a restored world. That was the secret. How is that going to happen? How is God going to bring about a healed world that's been restored from its brokenness? And that's it. Not the end of the world, but rather the end of what makes this world so terrible at times, from the beginning of something wonderful. It's describing the beginning of something wonderful. When a new heaven and a new earth is prophesied, that's what this means. A new heaven and a new earth. New, but not disconnected from what came before. So the apocalyptic writers wrote in a genre that was understood in the Middle East in the centuries before and after Jesus walked on the earth. And the writers sought to unveil through metaphor, poetry, graphic imagery, and symbolism what this transformative process between the old broken world and the new world would look like. The metaphors and the symbolism was never meant to be taken literally, no more than metaphor and poetry is meant to be taken literally. For instance, sometimes the time of the apocalypse is described like birth pangs, like a woman giving birth. That the birth pangs are a sign of great pain and distress in the world. That things are going to get a whole lot messier before they get better, but something is birthed at the end, and that's the point. Something beautiful and marvelous comes on the other side of the chaos, the calamity, the confusion, and the pain. But I want you to know something that you may not know. The way that we have interpreted these passages about the apocalypse is framing them as the end and also as something very scary and terrible. Well, this is a fairly new way of looking at these passages, like the one we just read from Matthew, the book of Revelation, passages from Daniel. We have inherited here a theological construct created by a Scottish Presbyterian minister named John Nelson Darby, who lived in the mid to late 1800s. And his way of reading the apocalyptic literature in the Bible is basically less than 2 centuries old. The way that our culture has been taught to understand these things, less than 2 centuries old. Words associated with it like dispensation and rapture, you may have heard that word rapture, not in the Bible. They came from Darby and his students. And I wish I could get more into this now. It's a fascinating history, but for the sake of brevity, just know that what the left behind way of reading these stories, that perspective, that way is not even 200 years old. And Christians from more than 1800 years before that never read their apocalyptic texts in this unique, idiosyncratic way. In Europe, the teachings of Darby were largely rejected, but missionaries were sent to the United States and Canada, and here it took off like wildfire. And then you fast forward 100 years or so, and what do you have? Well, today, it seems very normal to speak of the apocalyptic texts and prophecies in these terms, as if they were first telling the future, but also that they were foretelling of a future where everything was going to be terrible. But I'll remind you again, it's that way of thinking is brand new. And it's a breakaway from how these writings were originally intended to function in the communities that first received them. So true, the scripture we're considering from Matthew today is about the end of something. It's true. But what sort of end? And here's the point, and here's my perspective, and the perspective of the gospel writers, I believe. In Jesus, I believe. If the apocalypse must be thought of as an end, let it mean the end of violence, suffering, and sorrow, only to give way to a new order of peace, contentment, and joy. For this is what the apocalypse did mean in the time of Jesus. The event that people were surprised by in the text we consider today was the breaking in of something new and wonderful. And the text today is to help us come to terms with the good news that help is on the way, but also to help us learn about how to live in the midst of the distress and the in-between time between the way things are and the way things will one day be when things are restored. What should we do as we consider the world and all of its brokenness, especially whilst we are being impacted by it? The church that the gospel writer was addressing could look at their immediate surroundings and conclude that they were living it. Distress among nations, that was mentioned there, check. Cataclysmic global events, endless war, the very powers of heaven and earth seemingly shaken. This is all described in the verses that precede today's text that we're reading, which means there was no stable ground for the people to walk on. And all of that the follower of Jesus living in the Roman Empire needed to do was look around them. The Pax Romana, or the alleged peace of Rome, was held together by perpetual war. The memory of Pompeii's destruction suddenly by volcano would have been a traumatic and shared collective memory. The powers are shaken again and again and again. Political intrigue, assassinations of leaders, persecution and martyrdom of fellow followers of Christ. Yes, things were crazy. And it was in this context that Jesus speaks. And the message is basically, keep your head up. So hear his words on this first Sunday of Advent. In times like these, when things are still confusing, stay awake. Help comes when you least expect it. Don't miss it. Stay awake. And it comes when things seem bleak, like in the days of Noah, Jesus says. Those were bad times, we've been told. Those times were so bad that God felt sorry to have made the world. These are the sorts of times that cause us to use phrases like kids these days and go into hell in a handbasket. These are the times that cause us to give up or at best keep our heads down to avoid getting caught in the fray. But in the midst of the mundane, it comes, the realm of God. Our help comes in the midst of the mundane. Jesus points out that even though the world had fallen off the rails, people carried on doing what people do. They got married, they ate, they drank, they found diversions to pass the time, they laughed and they cried. And there seemed to be nothing particularly unique about the era. Just like today. And Jesus says that it comes so sudden that it's like when you're at work with a friend, say in a field, and suddenly your friend has been taken into the age that is to come, but you missed it. You were looking for it. You were lulled into complacency, the humdrum of work. You never suspected that God might transform the world. So you weren't looking for the signs of God's arrival, signs that are all around us. Jesus says in today's text that it comes so suddenly that it's as if two women were together grinding grain. Again, just about daily chores, and who knows, talking about their children, the weather, whatever it is people talk about when they are passing the time. But what are we to anticipate? Here is why it is telling that these apocalyptic readings are placed at the beginning of Advent. Because just as two women working about their daily chores might be surprised by the breaking in of God's realm, of God's blessing, Advent is the season of anticipating those sorts of surprises. We anticipate the arrival of God into our lives. We anticipate the coming of joy, hope, love, peace. Hence the naming of the 4 Advent candles: joy, hope, love, peace. And we anticipate God's great unveiling, the apocalypse of every good thing. Remember, apocalypse means an unveiling. And what is revealed here is life beyond our wildest hopes. And you could reframe the short parables in today's text for our modern times. For example, 2 friends are cooking the Thanksgiving meal. Joy broke into the room by way of the arrival of a long distant and much missed relative. The unveiling, the apocalypse of something good. One was swept up into that joy. The other missed it and was left out. Or 2 siblings were walking down the street when love found them by way of a kind word spoken by a stranger. One heard the voice and received the love that was conveyed by those words. The other was daydreaming and could not hear the voice. How if that one had stayed awake? Today, We are waiting for the coming of hope, joy, peace, and love. We are not waiting for the end, at least not the end of all that is good and pure. Rather, we are waiting for the end of everything evil and unwholesome, in the beginning of life that stretches out. Life that is filled with love. Life that, like the life of a child that has been untouched by the world, but still has wisdom as the life of one who has lived long enough to appreciate joy in its contrast with sorrow. So stay awake. We don't want to miss it. If I can go back to my childhood room for a minute to push that analogy I used earlier further, this means that I stay about my mother's work, cleaning my room, doing my best to put it to right. But if she comes, I will notice that she comes because I was not sleeping. I was doing my best to live faithfully. And what I discover is that my mother does not bring hell down on my head. Rather, she brings help. She says, I see you've done all that you can. Here, with my help, let's clean up this room together. That is what it will be like when the realm of God comes. And our help is coming. That is the central claim of Advent. Stay awake. You don't want to miss this help. Or if you've been asleep, here is an invitation to wake up. For Jesus tells us that it is precisely when the world seems most unstable or most caught in a rut. It is in that climate, and in that atmosphere, that God comes. And if you have eyes to see it, you will. If you are asleep, you'll be left back in the world in all of its hopelessness and lifeless living. The world as many of us have known it. It's like when I'm sound asleep too late in the day, and my daughter will sometimes, or any one of my 3 kids will sometimes wake me up in the afternoon from my nap and say something like, "Wake up, Daddy, you're missing it." And I say to you, on this first Sunday of Advent, help is coming. Morning is near. A light has come, is coming. So, wake up and feel its light and its love.